Welcome to our webinar on identifying and addressing emerging trends in the South Southwest region. And I'm excited to have all of you here today because as we're going to discuss some key developments that are shaping our region's health, about substance use, and about prevention. The landscape is definitely changing. And this webinar is designed to provide you with critical insights and practical strategies that you can implement in your own work. We hope that will help you to create healthier and more resilient communities with the information that we're sharing with you today. So we're going to explore some new data. We're going to look at some innovative approaches and also best practices. And I encourage active participation. And that's why we wanted to get you going, see how the chat's working for you. You'll be able to put your questions in the chat throughout the session as well. And we'll do our best to get all of your questions answered. I'm joined today by Wanda Hudson, who is my esteemed colleague. She'll also be answering any questions for you that you may have in the chat and be posting things for you as well that you may need. Richard Feinberg is our master of technology. If you have any problems during this session, you can directly chat with him as well, and he'll do his best to get things fixed for you. Of course, I'm Derek Newby. I'm your Region 6 PTTC TTA coordinator. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. So let's get started. This is our acknowledgments. It just lets you know that the opinions that you hear expressed herein are those of the PTC network, and they do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. So no official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions you hear described in this document are intended or should be inferred. I have the pleasure of introducing our two distinguished speakers to you today. Josh Essrick is the Chief of Training and Technical Assistance at Carnivale Associates. Mr. Essrick has over 10 years of experience researching, writing, evaluating, and presenting on substance use prevention and other behavioral health topics. He is truly an expert in providing training and technical assistance in substance use, having overseen the development of hundreds of TTA products for numerous clients, including 6 of SAMHSA's 10 regional prevention technology transfer centers, the PTTC network and coordinating office as well, and the Central East Addictions Technology Transfer Center, ATTC, and the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, better known as the MHTTC, and also for SAMHSA themselves, their Center for Application Prevention Technology, or the CAP team. He is joined by Olivia Stewart. Olivia Stewart is a research assistant with Carnivale Associates. She has experience researching, writing, and presenting on a wide variety of topics in the fields of behavioral health and criminal justice. And she provides programmatic support and training, as well as technical assistance for the SAMHSA Strategic Prevention Technical Assistance Center, or we call it the SPTAC, and the Central East Prevention Technology Transfer Center as well. Whew, it's just doing so much. Wherein she provides expertise in substance use prevention and mental health. Ms. Stewart is also a licensed master social worker in the state of Virginia. So put your virtual hands together for our two speakers today, and I will be handing the presentation over to Josh at this time.
Thanks, Derek. Hi, everyone. Want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope you're all doing well out there. And yeah, glad you're able to join us for this presentation all about emerging trends in the South Southwest region. So our overall roadmap for today is, and I hope you're all avoiding that hurricane, that folks talk about in the chat. So our overall roadmap for today is that we're going to learn more about emerging substance use trends. We're going to talk about the factors discussing those, influencing those trends. We're going to review opportunities and strategies for addressing those trends. And then we want you to evaluate us. Let us know how we did, how we can do better in the future for you. And this roadmap aligns with our specific learning objectives which are that by the end of the presentation, we hope that everyone who's joining today will be able to, first of all, explain the importance of incorporating emerging trend needs into ongoing strategic planning efforts, to be able to describe the scope and impacts of key emerging substance use trends, to be able to recognize the influence of the social determinants of health and other risk factors, risk and protective factors on emerging trends, and to be able to identify opportunities for addressing emerging trends as part of a comprehensive prevention approach. So we're going to try to fit a lot in today. We got a lot of content that we're going to cover. If you have any questions at any time, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them as we see them. We're also going to have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. Also, after pretty much every section of the presentation or subsection, we're going to have some questions for you all, and we'd love to see your answers to those questions in the chat as well. Really want to be able to hear from you and what you're seeing on the ground. So to kick things off, let's talk a little bit about the importance of addressing emerging trends, sort of why we're here today, why we want to pay attention to these sort of latest things that are going on, even if they're not necessarily the biggest issues yet. And in this section, I'm basically hoping to answer 4 questions for you, which are these 4 questions on the slide here. Why is this issue, meaning emerging trends, why are they important? What can we learn about emerging trends? How do emerging trends impact our existing work, and how do we go about addressing emerging trends? Again, just a bit of setup here, and then after that, we'll start talking about, well, what are these trends, and then getting into some of how we can address them. So beginning with why are emerging trends important? And I think the reason they're important is really illustrated by this image here on this slide, which is a somewhat abstract representation of the stages of a substance use epidemic. Basically, what it shows is that in any given epidemic, if it actually does become one, it's recognized to have sort of 3 general stages. Stage 1 is primarily the substance is showing up on the scene. There's a growing initiation of use, a lot of experimentation of the substance, but it's not necessarily being regularly used that often yet. And also, there's not that many consequences of use, like substance use disorders or overdoses, being seen yet, because the rates of use are still relatively low. However, given enough time, and if it is actually growing into an epidemic, eventually it will get to stage 2, where there starts to be pretty widespread prevalence of use. You start seeing rates in surveys going up and up. Start seeing the substance showing up more in other data, like law enforcement seizures, things of that nature. And then somewhat naturally, since the substances often have addictive characteristics, we eventually reach stage 3, where there's widespread substance use disorders. Sometimes by the time we get to stage 3, overall prevalence rates have actually gone down, because there might have been some people who truly were recreationally using and did stop, but the sort of consequences of use among people who are using the substance are just getting worse and worse. And you can see these stages show up in sort of in the recognized epidemics that we see, like in the opioid epidemic, if you sort of track it over the decades. And so the idea is, the earlier we can address a substance, the greater the impact we can have. If we're able to start implementing prevention services that focused on a substance while it still is in that initiation stage, that experimentation stage, we can really have the greatest impact possible on preventing the epidemic from growing as large as it otherwise might. Obviously, there's still lots of work we can do when a substance does reach stages 2 and 3, because there's always going to be people still at risk of beginning use. But we do want to start as early as possible, which means we need to know what those substances are that people are just initiating or experimenting with. And sometimes, that's as far as it goes. There's certainly been substances over the years that sort of popped up for a year or two and then sort of disappeared. They didn't become epidemics, but anytime there's an emerging trend, there is a risk that it does become the next big issue. And so we do want to stay on top of what's going on. We want to be aware, and we want to be able to, implement services as we can. And that's why, emerging trends are important. And that's why we're here today to talk about them. Now, as far as what we can learn about emerging trends, it varies, right? Because a lot of times there's not as much data as we want, especially early on with a substance. It might not be, on the regular national surveys yet. It might not be regularly tested for by forensic laboratories. So we might not have the full scope of the picture compared to substances that have been long running issues. But ideally, we'd like to learn about, for any given substance, the prevalence, sort of how widespread is use, as well as the consequences. What are the negative impacts of use? Basically explaining why we care about the substance. What are the harms that it's causing that we want to prevent? We also want to learn about the root causes of use, those risk and protective factors that are increasing the risk and likelihood. We want to learn about the populations being impacted. Who are the people that are using the substance? Are there any sort of disparities, especially around that environmental context? Are there various social determinants of health and inequities that are increasing their risk of the substance use or of the consequences from use that maybe we can address, and other relevant risk and protective factors we need to be aware of. Again, we might not have all this data right off the bat, but if we are trying to address emerging trends, we do want to be expanding our epidemiological surveillance needs assessment as much as we can, so we can collect this kind of data and learn about, well, what's going on. So how can we address it? How can we improve the health and wellness of our communities? So then the question is, all right, emerging trends are important to address. There's data around them, but how does addressing emerging trends impact our existing work? And the answer to that is it varies, all right? Anytime we get new information from a needs assessment, including the fact that there might be a new emerging trend in our community, if we're doing a proper, appropriate strategic planning, need to do some prioritization and balance the competing needs that we're facing. Because there are potentially emerging trends, but there's also going to be those, ongoing issues that we're just been trying to address for a long time and are continuing to going to be trying to address. And also, right, we don't want to be playing whack-a-mole, so to speak, of just like constantly jumping from substance to substance. We really do want to be addressing the underlying needs, those sort of deep-seated systematic inequities and disparities that can lead to risk of substance misuse. But at the same time, right, if there is an emerging trend, we might want to do work specifically focused on that, like raising awareness of the risks of use, making sure people understand that there's harms associated with it. And since we have limited resources in prevention, we do need to find that balance. We have to do that prioritization to figure out exactly what does it mean for our work that there is an emerging trend. And that is going to depend on the unique circumstances you're facing. Sort of how widespread is the emerging trend? What sort of resources do you have already, available? What resources would you have to pull from elsewhere? Do you have resources you can pull from elsewhere? It's going to depend, but it's important to do that work of thinking things through. And the way we do all of this work, as I already sort of previewed, is through strategic planning. And on this slide here, right, you see an image of the SPIF, SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework, which is their standard model for doing strategic planning. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but just as a reminder, right, like every step of the SPIF does relate to addressing emerging trends, right? As part of the went too fast. As part of the assessment phase, we want to be able to identify those emerging trends, and ideally as early as we can. We want to make sure we are asking the right questions of folks, and that's why these kinds of presentations like today can be potentially quite helpful. We're only going to be talking about state data and comparing it to national data as well. We don't have the time to like dive into specific localities, but it is worth knowing, hey, if this is an issue in your state or in your neighboring states, maybe it's worth starting to ask, is it actually showing up in the community and influencing how your assessment goes? And then in capacity building, right, if you have identified an emerging trend, you might need to think about, are there potentially, new partners you need to work with to provide either education or awareness raising or to implement environmental change strategies. in the planning phase, right? Then you'd be actually identifying what, if any, evidence-based programs and strategies you can implement to address these trends or the factors influencing the trends. Implementation, you're going to want to keep following all the best practices of implementation science to implement those strategies. And then an evaluation, right? We want to keep tracking how the trend is progressing in our community. Ideally, we get some comparison data, either sort of just looking at what's going on nationally compared to our own community or at the state level, or if we can even actually get any data from maybe neighboring communities to sort of see how we're doing compared to them, so we can sort of measure against that. That is always helpful because, right, if we are addressing an emerging trend, in all likelihood, no matter what we're doing, use might continue to go up. But if use is going up a lot less than it otherwise would be, thanks to our efforts, right, we can say, well, we're having an impact. We're doing better than we would be doing if we weren't doing anything at all. So it's useful having a comparison group if we can. And throughout all of this, right, we want to be upholding those principles of sustainability and cultural competency. And also, we want to be upholding that additional sort of overarching concept of equity. We want to be addressing those social determinants of health and those community inequities that might be increasing the risk of substance misuse and that are leading to those emerging trends. Which is why, I mentioned populations. We want to know, as I mentioned, specifically what populations are dealing with emerging trends, so we can learn about whether there are inequities that are influencing things. Because, sometimes an emerging trend isn't a new substance. It's a substance we're familiar with where it's getting worse, the use is getting worse among a specific population and it hadn't been before. That's also an emerging trend. It's a new issue that we need to better address. And we're going to be coming back to this, to the SPIF throughout this presentation as we sort of talk about each of the different substances that we have for you today. And so with that sort of in mind about why emerging trends are important and sort of what we can start to do to address them, we're now going to spend the next while talking about the scope and impacts of key substance use trends, as well as related risk and protective factors. I see that note from Mary. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope that the weather doesn't get too much worse. I do know that this presentation is being recorded, and that recording will be available later on as well. So if you do have any internet loss during the presentation, you will be able to access that recording later on. So for this next, as I said, we're about to dive into talking about substances and the way this section is organized by substance. And so for each substance or each trend that we're going to be talking about, we're going to first of all cover some basic data on prevalence, use rates, some basic data on consequences, the harms of use. We're going to talk about the data of perceptions of harm, which that is one of the key risk factors for substance use, people perceiving that it's not harmful to use. And to sort of preview things a little bit, an ongoing issue we're seeing, not just in the Southwest, but nationwide as well, is that for an awful lot of substances, people's perceptions of harm have been declining for the past several years. And it's not really known why yet, but it's certainly a very concerning trend that we need to be aware of and think about how we could be addressing that. We're also then to talk about other risk factors associated with the trend, and then have a little bit of discussion around the trend. We're just, as I mentioned, going to be providing a brief overview of each substance because we don't have the time to do a deeper dive, but I would certainly encourage you to sort of look further into the data if you do want additional information. So let's dive into things, beginning with new and novel substances, these are the substances that it's not just a difference in, a new trend in a certain population or things like that. These are like brand new substances that we're just seeing emerging on the scene. And also that they don't actually follow that structure I just laid out because in most cases, there's not nearly enough data. And some of these substances might not be an issue at all yet in your community. And there's a chance, right, they might never be, but there's also the chance that they could be the next big issue. And so it really is important that you keep on the lookout for them. So for these new and novel substances, we're going to talk a little bit about what the substance actually is, as well as go through what limited data we do have available. Um, so the first one we have is xylazine. I'm actually not going to say that much about xylazine because I understand that a lot of folks in the region are now familiar with it. I also want to note that the South Southwest PTC recently did a presentation all about xylazine, and I see Richard put the link into the chat there. So there's a lot more information actually out there on xylazine than the very brief overview I'll do right now, and I definitely encourage you to access that recording if you want more info. But the very high level version, right, is xylazine is a substance that is used in veterinary medicine and has legitimate veterinary uses, but has never been approved for any use among humans. Um, and but at the same time is not a controlled substance, at least at the federal level. Some states have started to make it a controlled substance, but so long as it's not controlled at the federal level, it means it's pretty easy for people to just buy online. Xylazine's not an opioid, but it is a sedative and also can act as a muscle relaxant. And most importantly, it has some very strong interactions with opioids, especially fentanyl, that if you mix xylazine with an opioid, it can dramatically extend the length of the euphoria or the high that people experience from it. And so over the past few years, xylazine has been found more and more frequently mixed with opioids. A lot of times people not even being aware that it's in there. Um, Xylazine is most commonly found actually more to the east than you all. The epicenter is basically Philadelphia. But it's been, if you look at maps and like the DEA has one, for instance, the CDC's put some out as well. It's sort of, you can see based off the overdose data, xylazine's use just sort of like radiating outwards from that epicenter and just spreading south as well as west. So even though it might not be the biggest issue yet in the South Southwest, it certainly has the potential to. We don't have data on use of xylazine. It's not asked about in the common sort of substance use surveys that SAMHSA puts out, for instance. It's not always tested for either when law enforcement seizes substances. We are starting to have more overdose data, which is not the best proxy measure of use, but it at least gives us some indication. Unfortunately, the data is a bit spottier than some other substances because, again, it's not always tested for. We do know that in 2021, there were over, you can see, almost 35, just under 3,500 fatal overdoses that involve xylazine, which is about nationwide, which is about double what it was in 2020, and that was about double what it was in 2019. And as the second data point shows, over this 3-year period, that about 9% of all fentanyl overdoses that were fatal involved xylazine. Now, it's only 9% because, unfortunately, right, if you dig into the data, there's just a huge number of fentanyl overdoses that are happening nationwide. But the point here is, xylazine very often is found with fentanyl. Almost every xylazine overdose actually does involve in fentanyl in some way. And in addition to the overdoses, the really other common consequence of xylazine are these necrotizing wounds that people start to develop, not only at the injection sites, but actually anywhere on their body. That can be very harmful if they're not properly treated. In the South Southwest region, as I mentioned, the fatal overdose rate involving xylazine is currently very low. It's about 0.15 per 100,000 people, meaning for every 100,000 people in the region, less than one person, 0.15 people had a fatal overdose. So that is a low number, but because some of the neighboring states to the region are having these increases, it's something we definitely want to keep an eye on. The second novel substance that we have for you today are nitazines. Nitazines are essentially a synthetic opioid like fentanyl. They're very new. They've only been found in the U.S. since 2019, and There's been a lot of types found, at least 12. I think it's actually more than 12 now, because the people producing nitazines, basically they're constantly changing the chemical compounds to try to get around controlled substance laws. The most common type of nitazine, its street name is iso, which is short for isonitazines. Um, and nitazines are an opioid. They're oftentimes, people don't know they're using it, either being mixed in with other opioids or being falsely marketed as something else. They respond to naloxone, and so in a lot of ways we could treat them like an opioid, except for the fact that they are extraordinarily potent. Um, some nitazines have been found to be up to be 43 times stronger than fentanyl. The most common nitazine, iso, it's found to generally be 5 to 9 times stronger than fentanyl. And just think about how strong fentanyl is, right? We used to talk about, fentanyl's 50 times stronger than heroin, which means it's 100 times stronger than morphine. And now we have this substance that's up to 43 times stronger than fentanyl. Because the nitazines are so strong, it very much increases the likelihood that if there is an overdose, people will need multiple doses of naloxone, and a single one won't be able to reverse the overdose. So there needs to be growing education around that. And it's because of that strength of nitazines that we're sort of talking about it separately rather than just in the context of other opioids. We don't really have any good data about how frequent nitazine use is occurring because it's not commonly tested for. We do know that since 2019, there's been at least 2,400 law enforcement seizures where substances that were seized tested positive for nitazine. That's that first bullet point there. We also know that the state of Tennessee did a study, and they found that they had 41 fatal overdoses involving nitazine in 2021. That's up from 10 in 2020 and 0 in 2019. So it sort of ramped up pretty quickly. Now we can't extrapolate from Tennessee to the whole country because obviously there can be very significant regional differences. But the fact that a single state did have 41 overdoses so shortly after the substance even showed up on the scene does suggest it's a really important substance for us to be thinking about. Three other novel substances I want to briefly mention are on this slide here. One of them actually isn't that novel, right? It's hallucinogens. We all know hallucinogens have been around for decades now, and they generally haven't been given that much attention by prevention, and usually use rates have been relatively low. The issue is that over the past several years, rates of hallucinogen use have been rapidly rising, especially among sort of younger adults as well as the middle-aged adults of the 35 to 50-year-old bracket, particularly around LSD. And in fact, by 2022, hallucinogen rates were at the highest on record, at least in SAMHSA's national survey. The 2023 data, which just came out, does paint a little bit of a mixed picture about whether use is continuing to rise or if it has plateaued a little bit. But the fact that it has risen so much, and the fact that hallucinogens do have potentially serious consequences, do mean that they're a topic that we need to start thinking about that maybe we haven't been in the past, especially because there's a risk that hallucinogens follow the sort of same trajectory that cannabis has been following, where right now, with cannabis, there's been a debate around legalization. It's been going on for a number of years. More and more states have been legalizing use, and that sort of dramatically impacted perceptions of harm. And relatedly, use of cannabis has gone way up overall. And hallucinogens are now having that debate around legalization as well. And so there's that risk that it follows that same trajectory of that leading to declining perceptions of harm, and that then leading to further increases in use. Now, there is some research, right, suggesting that for some limited cases, in some limited circumstances, some hallucinogens might have legitimate medical uses. And obviously, we don't want to hinder people's legitimate medical access, but we want to make sure that even if that is relevant, that we're not letting just misuse occur, right? Just like prescription opioids have legitimate medical uses, but we still don't want misuse occurring. So we want to be thinking about about hallucinogens. Next up is tienpitin. Its street name is known as gas station heroin. It is used in some other countries as an antidepressant, although that's actually changing because more countries have been realizing some of the harms that it can cause. It's never been approved by use by the FDA, and is usually marketed. It's not a controlled substance, so people can just find it, often at gas stations. Usually marketed either as an antidepressant or dietary supplement. But if you take it in large enough quantities, its effects do start to mimic heroin. And there have been some number of cases of poisonings occurring. We don't know how frequently use is occurring. Some states have started to ban tienpitin. Last I saw, there were 10 of them, and that includes the state of Louisiana. So there is starting to be effort at the state level to address it. And we don't really have that much other data about it. But again, it's something to keep an eye on, especially if you're in one of the other states where it literally is just available for sale at the gas station, and is in very professional looking packaging, as you can see by the image at the bottom of the slide there. The next one we have is bromazolum, which is a substance that, again, was never approved for any medical use. It is a sedative that has been appearing more and more frequently mixed in with opioids such as fentanyl. But because of its because of its potential effects, its use actually can be life-threatening even in the absence of other drugs. It can cause respiratory depression, which is oftentimes the fatal element of an overdose. And then, if it's being mixed with other substances that can cause respiratory depression, like fentanyl, it can become even more threatening. And we have very little data on bromazolum, but you can see as the last bullet point shows, that there has been some exponential growth in the number of law enforcement seizures, where over a 3-year period at first, there's only 3 seizures per year. Then a couple years, we don't have any data. 2022, then we have 104 seizures. And by 2023, we have 913. And I'll say I talked a little bit about bromazolum in a presentation that I did at NPN this year. And in the audience there were a couple medical examiners who said that they've been seeing bromazolum actually a lot in the overdose cases that they've been dealing with in their town, which unfortunately I forget exactly where that was, but that is at least an anecdotal piece of evidence that folks are seeing it. And then the last sort of new and novel substance I want to mention are synthetic cannabinoids, which are lab-made chemicals that are designed to mimic the effects of cannabis, but very much are not cannabis. They've been found to be up to 100 times stronger than THC. They can have some really negative effects on folks. There's very little data that is out there on use or prevalence, but there's something that we really want to keep an eye on, especially around that issue of people not understanding that it's not, like, the name is a misnomer. It's not cannabis. It is something so much stronger that we want to make sure people aren't harming themselves with. And so I know I went a little bit fast through that section. Part of it is because we just don't have much data out there. But so this was more just introducing some of those new and novel substances, as I mentioned, before we get into details of other substances. But I wanted to ask you all, does this data match what you're seeing? Are you familiar with these substances that I just mentioned? Are they things that are showing up in your communities? Are there other sort of brand new substances that you're seeing instead? Just sort of what's going on in your own communities? And I'd love to see, in the chat, what folks are thinking or seeing. And at the same time, sort of also wondering if you don't have that data, or you don't know what the data is showing there, sort of thinking instead, well, knowing that these substances are potentially on the rise, how might this change your current work? Or what other information do you think you might need to be able to address them? And like I said, if folks want to share in the chat, would love to see it. I see a few answers coming in now. Rebecca mentioned never heard bromazolum before, which, as I mentioned, not these substances aren't showing up everywhere yet. And, as I was talking about, most of this data that we do have is really just national data because we don't have the more local data. So it's not surprising if you haven't heard of it yet. But like I said, just something to keep an eye out on. I see Jennifer mentioned we've seen a lot of synthetic cannabinoids as well as related Delta products. Michael mentioning a lot of discourse on TikTok, right, about whippets, right? Like, yeah, right, yeah. Anastasia mentioned we've seen fentanyl and xylazine. Lydia mentioned xylazine and the lack of knowledge around it. And yeah, a lot of good feedback in here, which is and thoughts, which are great to see. Um, and Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, since Hawaii doesn't have a direct land connection to the rest of the country, I don't know to what extent trends might be a little bit different there, but definitely interesting to hear what's going on there. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for sharing those in there. And like I said, also if you have any thoughts on sort of how this might change your current spiff work, or yeah, if there's any thoughts on like what other data might you need, I would love to see that. In the interest of time, I am going to turn the presentation over to Olivia now to start talking about some other trends. I did see at one point someone had their hand raised. It doesn't look like it is now. If you do have a question, I said, please put it in the chat, and I'll try to address it while Olivia is talking, or we can sort of address it during the Q&A portion as well. And yeah, if you're still typing, love to see all these answers in the chat. But yeah, Olivia, do you want to take? Oh, sorry, double clicked on you.
Oh, yeah, you're okay. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So, I'm going to be talking about two of our emerging substance use trends today. The first one being alcohol use. Alcohol misuse is something that's kind of been an ongoing priority problem in prevention. It's a place where I think we can confidently say we've made some pretty good progress, but is something that still requires our attention, especially as we're starting to see some interesting trends that are emerging that we'll get into through these slides. I wanted to quickly note before we get into these slides that we got all of our data for my slides and the slides that Josh will come back and present after I'm done from two places. The data on general use, age, any racial information, state level stuff all comes from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or the NSDA. And then all of our data on overdoses and mortality comes from CDC's wide-ranging online data for epidemiological research, or CDC Wonder. There's lots of great places to get this data from, but we chose to just stick with these two data sources to make sure we're keeping things really consistent across the board. So our first alcohol slide is about past month underage alcohol use. And I kind of want to set up and describe a few things first. So this data comes from MISDA, like I mentioned, and they define underage as being between 12 and 20 years old. We also use past month here instead of past year or lifetime use because past month is indicative of active use. And so you'll see here and on all the rest of the data slides that we have for you today that each state is a different color with a little different symbol to represent it. And then you'll always be able to see that national number because that's the green dotted line.
We're not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing the screen, Anastasia?
No, ma'am. I see you guys.
Are other folks having a similar problem?
Yeah, I can see this. I can see it.
I can see it.
I can. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Anastasia,
I can see.
tech difficulties then.
Okay. Hmm.
Okay, so to get back into it, so the data that you see here are the biannual state level data. So this is showing us changes in past month underage alcohol use between 2017 and 2022, which is the last year that we have the biannual state data available. So we can kind of see what's going on here is a decline over time. Nationally, underage alcohol use declined from about 19.3% to 14.6%, which is great. We heard a lot about spikes in alcohol use during COVID. This isn't really something that we saw with underage alcohol use in this region, with the exception of maybe Oklahoma. That's again now kind of trending downward, but we'll have to see if that trend will hold or if it's actually rising, and that was a little bit of an outlier. The next slide that we have is displaying past month binge alcohol use. And so this data is of all ages, so 12 and older, youth and adults. And so the NISDA defines binge drinking as drinking 4 or more drinks on the same occasion for women and 5 or more drinks on the same occasion for men on at least one day of the past 30 days. And so we can see here on this slide that it generally has gone down, maybe not quite as much as youth alcohol use has gone down, but it's declined nationally from about 24.5% in 2018 to 21.7% in 2023. And so counter to our last slide here, we can kind of see how in some states, in Oklahoma and New Mexico specifically in this region, we did potentially see that post-COVID increase in binge drinking. There's also a pretty significant racial and ethnic disparity that I do want to mention here. In 2022, American Indian and Alaska Native people had a past month binge drinking prevalence of around 30%, which is nearly 9 points higher than the national average. So it's really important for us to kind of consider these types of disparities when we're looking at the data and not just this aggregate state level data, because they might be a byproduct of or kind of reflect some of those systemic inequities that we see as a part of the social determinants of health and are really worth our attention to kind of look at and discuss when we're thinking about the need to tailor prevention services to be more culturally responsive. So on this slide here, we have deaths with alcohol-induced causes over time. And so this data comes from CDC Wonder, and I want to kind of describe a few things going on in this chart before we actually talk about what it means. So death from alcohol-induced causes means that the death record showed that from the coroner, medical examiner, whomever, that alcohol was a contributing factor in a person's death. And so this is how we kind of observe that substance-related mortality. The numbers that you see on here are not percentages. So this is not saying that in Arkansas in 2018, 10.9% of residents died from an alcohol-induced cause. This is the per capita crude rate of death. So this means that for every 100,000 people in the state of Arkansas, 10.9 people died from alcohol-induced causes. And so the reason that we measure and report mortality in this way is because it reflects those differences in population between states or regions. Like we know that the population in Texas is going to be a lot larger than it is in Oklahoma. So if we report just the number of deaths, it might be higher in Texas because there's more people living there. So we really want to get to the rate of deaths to kind of level the playing field and see what's really going on. So we can really see that kind of in contrast to some of that progress that we've seen in the prevalence of underage drinking and binge drinking going down, we're actually seeing these numbers increase across the board. We can see that nationally from 2018 to 2022, the rate of death from alcohol-induced causes increased from 11.4 to 15.4 per 100,000. This is particularly alarming here because we see that nearly 10-point jump in New Mexico, which is a pretty big cause for concern. This really all implies that while the prevalence might not have increased, the severity has increased among people who are binge drinking. And this does kind of tie into increases in suicide deaths that we've seen as well. So definitely an area where we should make sure that we're focusing in on. So next we have the data on perceptions of harm from alcohol use. Like Josh mentioned earlier, this is kind of the metric that we use to better understand people's perceptions of the risk, because having a lower perception of harm means that you don't really believe that you'd incur that much risk by using a substance, which in turn then increases your risk of using the substance, right? So the blue bar is the perception of harm in 2017, and the green bar is 2022. And like Josh also mentioned, generally across the country, we are seeing perceptions of harm decrease for all substances. But for alcohol, that decrease is actually quite small, just about 1%. So we can see in the region that we're seeing pretty tiny decreases in most states, a little bit larger of a decrease in Texas, nearly 4.5%. But the good news is that's practically stagnant in Oklahoma, and we're actually seeing very small increases in perceptions of harm in Louisiana and New Mexico, which is a good thing. So then here we have some examples of some of the key risk factors for alcohol misuse. Not a comprehensive list by any means, but these are some of the big ones. First is early age of alcohol initiation. So the data has shown us that people who start using alcohol before the age of 15 are actually 6 times more likely to develop alcohol dependency compared to those who start use after 21, which is why prevention programs in adolescents remain such a super important part of the work that we do. Lack of school engagement, self-reported peer and parental disapproval, Obviously, ease of access is a big risk factor. Luckily, though, we are actually seeing some steady declines in the self-reported youth access to alcohol from the past few years. There's also the risk of positive perceptions of alcohol use. This is pretty high among college-age youth, where alcohol use is seen as, being highly normalized and encouraged by peers. And then we've also just been seeing a reduced access to prevention services. Over 6 years, between 2016 and 2022, the percentage of youth who participated in a prevention program outside of school declined by about 5%. And the percent who saw a prevention message outside of school declined by about 10%. So this is kind of a trend that we have seen before COVID and maybe is exacerbated by COVID. So definitely something to kind of keep at the forefront. So after seeing all that data, I would kind of like to hear from you guys. And I know that I went through it pretty quickly, and I do apologize for that. We've fallen a couple minutes behind, and we have a lot of stuff to get through. So I'm just kind of curious, do these data match what you're seeing in your state? I know some folks are from the states in this region, but I've seen lots of other folks from other states. So I'm really curious whether this is matching some of the things that you're seeing for alcohol use. Now we're seeing, okay, Derek says yes for Arkansas. Yeah. Kelsey says yes, our youth perception of harm is scary low for a rural county here in Wisconsin. New Mexico is definitely accurate, according to Brandy. Is there any other information that you think that you would need to be able to kind of do your work? I mean, something that I only briefly mentioned was a little bit about racial disparities, but is that something that would be kind of something that you would want to look into more yourself if you were looking at this data? Oh, Rebecca says rural Iowa is having the same problem. Decrease in alcohol use among youth, but youth increased use of THC and more DUIs to THC. Christina, you are previewing the next section, which will be cannabis, so that's interesting. And I'm seeing more information on how to combat the perception of low risk of harm without reaching into fear tactics. We'll talk a little bit about education and awareness, which might help. Racial disparity, gender disparities, consumption per capita data. These are great. I'm going to go ahead and move us forward for the sake of time, but y'all have presented some really, really fantastic points in here. And so like Christina kind of mentioned, now we're going to transition into the next substance, which is cannabis. Obviously, things with cannabis have been changing a lot across the country. We're seeing availability increase, illicit and legal access, which I think you'll see reflected in a lot of the data that we have today. So as a great example of this chart is showing us past month cannabis use from 2017 through 2022. Obviously, we're seeing increases across the board in the region, really in the country, with some of these states in the region having a much sharper increase, like in New Mexico and Oklahoma, than the rate at which the national numbers have increased. Nationally, past month cannabis use was at about 9.8% in 2018 and rose to 15.4% in 2023. Just to kind of give you an example of how rapidly this has been changing, Richard has put something in the chat. If you have the chance to repost it, Richard, since a couple comments have come in, we have a handout with some maps showing some of the changes in state legalization policy. In 2020, 35 states and DC had legalized medical cannabis use, with 16 of those also legalizing recreational use. And then in just 3 years, that went up to 38 states with legalized medical cannabis use and 25 with recreational use. So now at this point, almost 74% of US residents live in a state with legalized medical or non-medical cannabis use, which is just wild. So in the South-Southwest region specifically, as you might know if you're working in the region, the only state with legalized medical and non-medical use as of 2023 is New Mexico, which is interesting kind of given the data that we're seeing here. The other states have legalized medical use only, with the exception of Texas, which again, as of 2023, had no legalized use. Clearly, that's being reflected in the data because Texas has the lowest use out of any state and is lower than the average. But it's interesting that we're kind of still seeing that increase in use over time regardless. So we can see that legalization is a significant impact within the state where it's happening, but it probably isn't the only driver. Alrighty, and so now this chart here is showing us past month cannabis use by age in just 2022. We can see nationally and across the region, use is highest among young adults age 18 to 25. And once again, our two states that are higher than the national average for all ages here are New Mexico and Oklahoma. We're also seeing youth use in Louisiana slightly higher than the national rate. If we compare this to the numbers from 2018, which we don't have on the slide, youth cannabis use has actually gone down slightly. It kind of remained mostly stable, but down slightly. It was at about 6.6% in 2018 and now 6.3% in 2022. Young adult use increased by about 3% during that same period, and the largest increase was among those 26 and older, who had about 5% increase in use nationally. So again, here we have our perceptions of great risk of harm from cannabis. And like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing this decrease along with pretty much every other substance. The decrease in most of the states of the region does match the national decrease pretty closely, with the exception of Texas, which has seen an 8-point decrease in perception of harm, despite, again, not having any legalized use in the state. And I also wanted to note that in general, these numbers are extremely low. So we're seeing from our national data here that in 2022, just about 2 in 10 adults nationally thought that there was any risk from using cannabis. And so then here are a few of the key risk factors that we've identified for cannabis use. So engaging in antisocial behaviors like delinquency, aggression, impulsivity, also having a higher perception of peer cannabis use, so some of those social norms, parental acceptance of cannabis use, which is very interesting to me given the fact that, more parents now may be using cannabis in front of their children just because, people are seeing it similarly to alcohol now. High rates of family conflict. Young adults may use cannabis as a coping method, trying to get out of the house when it's a really tense environment. There's also a risk from low policy enforcement rates. In some communities, sanctions against cannabis use are kind of becoming more rarely applied because a lot of times it just doesn't feel worth it compared to some of those other issues that are going on because, other substances have perceptions of harm that are just so much higher. And then finally, going back to a lot of what we've kind of been talking about already, the non-medical legalization factors, including just the legalization debate itself and the normalization of use that kind of accompanies that debate when it's just that ongoing national or state level conversation. So this is really a place where I think we can see the value of some of those environmental strategies, messaging campaigns, policy enforcement, those types of strategies in trying to reduce cannabis use. And so again, we kind of have these similar questions. I'm curious. I need to look through the chat because I think some folks have been talking about cannabis use a little bit already. But do these data match what you're seeing? And if it does or doesn't, how is this changing your current spiff work? I see someone saying, Christina says the belief that THC is safer to use than alcohol. Yes, that is also very interesting. And that you're seeing the same things in Washington as well. And Lori said too, it's difficult to show youth cannabis can be dangerous when their parents are telling them otherwise. So it takes educating the adults too. That's 100% true. And especially when we think about the fact that we see, the word medical marijuana, right? Medical cannabis. I think that kind of comes with some perceptions that people have as well. And also that the brain is still developing until age 25. That's right. That's why youth intervention is so important. The lack of long-term studies on cannabis has been hard too. And I like that this person said we need to work harder with youth on how to cope with difficulties in life. Resilience, we didn't talk about protective factors just because we didn't have the space, but resilience is a huge protective factor for a lot of substances. So I'm going to hand things back over to Josh to talk about a couple more emerging trends, but please keep posting away in the chat. Thank you, guys. So Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Hi again, everyone. So the next sort of substance we want to talk about the latest trends with are stimulants. Stimulants, there's essentially three main types: cocaine, methamphetamine, and prescription stimulants. Prescription stimulants generally have the least amount of data around them. And so we're actually not going to talk too much about them today. And as we'll show in the data, methamphetamine is greater concern right now in the southwest region than cocaine. So that's what we're really focusing on today. Whereas cocaine's been pretty stable in its use rates, even though we're not showing you the data right now. But as you can see here, methamphetamine use rates have been increasing. They even back in 2017, they were higher than the national average, and the national average has been going up, but the increase has been even greater in most of the states of the region. You can see in Texas, the data is a little bit lower, but generally we are seeing this return to methamphetamine use. Now, obviously, there was a methamphetamine epidemic back in the early 2000s. Data collection was pretty different back then, so we can't really make direct comparisons. We know that 2008 was basically the height of that past epidemic, but we can't really compare that to what's going on right now. And I see a question about excessive caffeine use, and if there's a way to identify that at all. I actually don't know. That's a really good question, but I don't know actually of a way to identify that, because yeah, a lot of times there aren't really survey questions about that. But definitely, if anyone has any thoughts on that or has seen anything around measuring excessive caffeine use, so definitely love to see that in the chat, because I would be learning as well. So we see methamphetamine use is increasing, and if we look at the age data, we see a similar pattern in the southwest as we do nationwide, which is that use is really that increase is primarily driven by adults age 26 and older, which we know is a change from what was going on 20 years ago when methamphetamine use was increasing. Back then, it was more among the young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds. Now it's more among the 26 plus age or even older. Well, I mean, that fits in with the 26 plus if someone's like in their 30s or 40s, but it really is adults who are initiating methamphetamine use, which means that any prevention programs focused on methamphetamine would need to be focusing actually, on adults. And as I think we all know, it's a lot harder to find evidence-based prevention programs that serve adults rather than youth. But it's definitely a challenge there. And this chart here it talks about overdoses. We actually are looking at both cocaine and methamphetamine. I put the cocaine in as a point of comparison, and you can see that it is increasing as well. The way to read this chart, because there's a lot going on, right, is that the 4 bars on the left of the graph are the southwest region. The 4 on the right are the nationwide. And so the blue is 2018 and the green is 2022. So we can see that rates of cocaine involved overdoses as well as methamphetamine involved overdoses have increased in the southwest and nationwide. But we see that while nationwide the two are relatively close to each other, although methamphetamine is a bit higher, we see a much larger gap in the southwest where methamphetamines are overdoses are much more frequently occurring than cocaine. And these increases in overdoses are actually much higher than the increases in use we just saw. And we don't really have a definitive answer on why that's the case, but there's sort of 3 primary reasons why we think it's going on. One is that cocaine as well as methamphetamine are a lot more pure and a lot more potent than they used to be. Speaking of methamphetamine especially, most methamphetamine is now produced by transnational criminal organizations rather than sort of backyard labs. Those do still exist, but there's not nearly as many of them. And as production has industrialized, it's led to much stronger substances that are way more potent than what was being used in the past, and that does increase the risk of overdose. But also, there's that issue, which Christina has already previewed in the chat, that both of these substances can frequently be mixed in with fentanyl, and so people might be consuming these substances who actually have no opioid tolerance because they're not thinking they're going to use an opioid, and then are at a much greater risk of experiencing an overdose. I will say, if you dig deep enough into the data and start like parsing out stimulant-involved overdoses that involve fentanyl versus not involving fentanyl, which you can do through the National Vital Statistics System, which you can access through CDC's Wonder system, you'll see that Yeah, a lot of these overdoses do involve fentanyl, but even if you exclude the fentanyl deaths, the numbers are still going up. So it's not just a fentanyl issue. It's not just a continuation of the opioid epidemic. Um, However, the opioids do play a part in it, and it's likely because of fentanyl, to at least some extent, that we see the big disparities in overdose rates by demographic, especially actually cocaine. So in the Southwest in 2022, you can see the overall rate of cocaine overdoses, right, was at 4.8 per 100,000 people. I can tell you that, for instance, among the people who are white, it was 3.9, but among African Americans, it was actually 11.5. And cocaine rates are not higher among opioid rates are not higher among African Americans than among other populations. Cocaine rates, though, are a little bit higher, but not nearly to that extent. And likely what's going on, I know this is what's happening in the Central East region, is that that sort of issue around not having opioid tolerance at all is causing these overdoses among people who aren't expecting it. But also, obviously, there's disparities on access to naloxone, access to care that we're concerned about as well. So definitely a thing to think about when it comes to overdoses. We don't actually have perceptions of great risk of harm of methamphetamine, unfortunately. The national survey doesn't ask about it. I don't know why. It's unfortunate. All we have is cocaine, and we can see for whatever reason that the same thing's going on national with basically all substances is happening here too, where perceptions of great risk of harm are going down, even though overdoses are going up. So it's just remains just ever-present concern right now for prevention. We do have some research on the other risk factors around methamphetamine use, which you can see on the slide here. Some of them do involve, other substance use. There is risk of polysubstance use occurring. I think this is particularly true among methamphetamine because it is often something that people start using later in life rather than as a youth. That family history, though, of use and sort of experiencing adverse childhood events or ACEs that stem from family history of substance use or criminal behavior can influence risk. Also, that history of criminal justice involvement. You can see some of those other risk factors that we've identified as well, including that increased availability, which stems from the fact that methamphetamine production in North America has increased so much over the past few years. So the same questions we have for each section have for this one as well for you. Do these data match what you're seeing? Are you seeing this sort of rise in methamphetamine in your communities? Are you seeing this rise in sort of fatal overdoses of methamphetamine or of cocaine, and sort of the issue of fentanyl use mixed into it? So curious about that, as well as the other two questions of how might this kind of information change your work, and what other information do you need? I see a question in the chat. Yeah, I believe these slides will be available, and there will be a recording made available as well. So I've got that for you. And I see actually a comment about contamination and sort of testing. There's a few which was actually being asked of another participant, but I can jump in really quickly and say that there's a few different ways. One is, with the testing at by coroners or medical examiners of looking into overdoses, but also fentanyl test strips, which in some states are legally drug paraphernalia, so you can't use them, but we do in a lot of states. There are fentanyl test strips that does make it a lot easier to sort of test for how frequently fentanyl is appearing in other substances, and really can give us a clean picture there. All right, and in the interest of time, I'll keep moving forward since I don't see any other answers in the chat, but would love to see if what you all seen around stimulants in your community. And in the meantime, let's talk a bit about opioids. So 2022 was the first year that NISDA actually gave us a comprehensive opioid misuse data point. Before that, they would give we have data for many years now around heroin as well as prescription opioid misuse, but it was never asking about fentanyl use. And so up until 2022, so we never had this comprehensive measure. I can't give you sort of an overtime, here's what's going on around opioid misuse overall. We do have it for specific substances, which I'll give on the next slide. But this slide is just for the first point in time that we have the data. Here's what past year opioid misuse by age looked like, where we can see that it's high among both emerging adults as well as adults compared to youth, but it's sort of across the board a challenge. But it's hard to read too much right into 1 year's data. Past year prescription pain reliever, which means past year prescription opioid, just pain reliever is the term NISDA uses. This data is here. If we stretch this data back to about 2012, we would see a decline basically year over year because there have been these declines in prescription pain reliever misuse. Now, in a lot of cases, it was then being substituted by heroin use and then fentanyl use, but prescription pain reliever misuse was going down. It's still way higher than we'd like, but it was going down. And so it's really concerning that actually we see in the most recent year that we're by the 2-year period of 2021 to 2022, that not nationally, but in most states of the region, there was actually this increase again. Now, it's a relatively small increase, and I don't want to read too much into 1 year of data, but it's definitely something concerning to keep an eye on, that if prescription opioid misuse is actually increasing again, as opposed to it continuing to decline. Obviously, the opioid epidemic as a whole has not been really improving that much, but prescription pain relievers specifically, because there were a lot of successful strategies like the prescription drug monitoring programs, like changing the formulas to make it harder to misuse them, like OxyContin did in 2010. We were seeing success there. So again, something definitely we want to keep an eye on. But obviously, the biggest issue, which I think we all know of when it comes to the opioid epidemic, is fentanyl, which, again, we don't really have comprehensive data on use, but we sure do have a lot of data on overdoses. And we see just how high the numbers are compared to any other substance, which is why we are so concerned about fentanyl. You may have seen stories in the news in the past couple of weeks about the preliminary data showing that there's actually been a decline in 2023. This would be awesome news if it's confirmed, especially after the enormous jump we had during COVID. I'm not showing the data here because, first of all, the state level preliminary data is really incomplete, but also just in my experience, that preliminary data can potentially change quite a bit before it gets finalized. So I'm not, unlike the news stories I saw, I personally am not going to celebrate until I see the data, the final data, showing that there has been any sort of decline in 2023. 2022 is the most recent year we do have data, and we can see that for the most part, all right, it didn't go up as much as it had during COVID, but it still was going up. And so this chart here, I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff to be said about fentanyl overdoses, but this chart here is sort of why we never stop talking about them and trying to focus on the issue of overdoses and of the opioid epidemic. And speaking of the opioid epidemic, as well, we have the perceptions of great risk of harm of heroin, which you can see are much higher than of other substances we've talked about today, but have actually seen the same decline that we're seeing in every other substance in every other state, that perceptions of great risk of harm are going down. And this is the one that really stands out to me, because the idea that with everything going on with the opioid epidemic, that anyone's perceptions of the harm of opioids would decrease, just it stands out to me. And to be honest, I don't have we have some strategies that we can try to work on to improve perceptions of harm. But this one in particular suggests that we really might need to start thinking about some innovative strategies, testing out new options. Because again, the perceptions are still high, but the fact that they went down at all, I think really is a shocking point for us. Um, we do have also, obviously, though, other risk factors for opioid misuse beyond those perceptions of harm. You can see some of them here. I also want to note, right, that there's a lot of research on just risk factors for substance misuse overall. When it comes to specific substances, though, like opioids or methamphetamine or any others, there's not always as much research about like these factors have been specifically focused. So these factors have been specifically identified with this substance. So we don't always have as much we can say, but we know, right, that with substance misuse overall, there's a lot of other risk factors as well. Around the social determinants of health, around stress and anxiety, adverse childhood experiences, and things of those nature. Um, and so again, sort of the group discussion point, so just curious what you all have seen related to the opioid epidemic. I'm sure it's an issue you've been dealing with for a while now. And there isn't potentially not too much changing, maybe a little bit, but really just sort of like this on the main issues, fentanyl overdoses as well as other opioid overdoses continue to be a major challenge. And if prescription pain relievers are increasing, that does if misuse of them is increasing, it does also suggest that we might need to be trying out something new because our strategies up until now have been very successful. Yeah. And I want to also, while folks might be typing, I want to thank Shavi Edwards for sharing that really interesting info about methamphetamine use in the chat. And yeah, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn things over to Olivia to start talking a bit about strategies, but again, or opportunities for addressing emerging trends. But again, would love to see any thoughts people have on the data in the chat. So Olivia.
Thank you, Josh. Hi again, everyone. So yeah, I'll round us out now and kind of talk about what we can actually do about all the emerging trends that we've been discussing today. We have a lot of opportunities to address emerging trends as part of a comprehensive approach to prevention. And so a comprehensive approach means that we're really implementing prevention strategies in a coordinated, collaborative way, kind of addressing the problem from multiple angles from top to bottom. And so we're going to talk about 4 strategies that are part of a comprehensive approach to prevention. And we're just kind of previewing this here now. So when we move from one to another, it doesn't seem confusing. But we'll talk about implementing a public health approach, engaging in advocacy, promoting education and awareness campaigns, and then also the opportunities for prevention to collaborate with harm reduction providers. As we go through these slides, start to think about whether you've actually done any of these things in your work. And if you did, like, what has that looked like for you? Or if not, things that you might like to do. I would love to see if folks put stuff in the chat since there's been some pretty great conversations in some of the chat threads, because I think folks might find it really interesting what you have to say. So first is really our public health approach. And so this is focused on the health and safety and well-being of entire populations. So really trying to provide maximum benefit for the largest number of people by preventing disease and promoting healthy behaviors. And so it's conceptualized through these 4 steps here on the screen. First is before we can even address a problem, we need to know how big the problem is, where it is, and who it affects. And so we accomplish this by gathering and analyzing data, which is a process called surveillance. I think folks are familiar with epidemiological surveillance. So typically public health uses different methods and technologies than we might in prevention. They do a lot of spatial mapping technology to kind of interpret and communicate some of that community data. But these data really show us how the problem changes over time. This is how we learn about the emerging trends and also lets us know what sort of impact the programs are having in addressing them. And this is really key because decision makers use these data when they're allocating programs and resources to areas that are in most need. Second, it's not really enough to know that a certain type of problem is affecting some group of people in a particular area, right? We also need to know why. As we've been talking about a lot today, there's a lot of factors that influence a person's chance of developing a substance use disorder. So once we've kind of identified those risk and protective factors, then we can start to develop and implement the programs to eliminate or reduce the risk factors or to capitalize on or increase the factors that protect people. Then in the third step, we kind of put that knowledge into action. Using the information that we've gathered across our research, now we're developing strategies to prevent substance use problems in the community. So you would implement the strategy or multiple strategies in communities experiencing the problem. And we really want to make sure we're studying the effects of these strategies to figure out whether and how well they're working, and specifically for whom. And so the information that we learn throughout this is what helps us identify any elements that might need to change. And then lastly, we want to assure widespread adoption. So any research that's kept in a vacuum is not going to be helpful to anybody. So researchers really need to share their findings in places where people can actually find them. And so this last step is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of the public health approach, right? Strategies that are shown to be effective in step 3 are then disseminated and implemented broadly in step 4, so that we're now addressing whole community or population level health. So when we talk about utilizing a public health approach, this is kind of how we can conceptualize it in prevention. So first, implementing true epidemiological surveillance, really taking the time to gather that comprehensive data in the community, especially about emerging trends, mapping out those areas of high need and those areas that have high resources. Then connecting priority issues to their underlying causes by identifying those important risk and protective factors, weighing their importance, their changeability, and then connecting with community partners who can really, help address some of those issues. Then connecting our program planning process to the underlying causes, really utilizing the information that we've gathered on our risk and protective factors to identify some of those best fit strategies to address our emerging trends. Making sure that we consider, how can we potentially adapt some of these things to be more culturally responsive if we need to. Then supporting pilot programs and expanding the evidence base, making sure that we're implementing programs effectively, constantly monitoring progress so that we know if and when we need to pivot to be sure that we're really making change. And then lastly, sharing best practices and lessons learned with others, not just about our outcomes, but about our processes too. And if you notice, this may look an awful lot like a certain strategic prevention framework that we've talked about a lot today. So we can really see how these 4 steps of the public health approach are integrated and applied to our work in prevention. So then the next strategy we have is engaging in advocacy. Advocacy is a really, really important way for prevention professionals to go about making change. It's an evidence-based approach, meaning that it's really rooted in sharing facts and data, best practices, and policy approaches to go about making change. Anybody can participate in advocacy, and it can be implemented at all levels. You can advocate on behalf of yourself, other staff members, clients, or even the community at all levels of government. But the most effective advocacy really involves building and maintaining ongoing positive relationships with your community members, other organizations and allies, policymakers, and especially policymakers' staff. Those are really, really important folks to get to know. And so advocacy can look like many different things, right? Maybe you're writing a op-ed for a local newspaper about the emerging trend that you're seeing and kind of the need to address it. Maybe you're inviting a policymaker and their staff to a local event that you're having to educate them on the issue. Advocacy could even be, making changes within your own agency's policies to make sure that they're more trauma-informed or equitable. But ultimately, advocacy really supports other environmental strategies. Things like media campaigns or policy change are a direct result of advocacy efforts. And so that's how we use advocacy to really address emerging trends. Advocating for free testing strips at the library, for putting prevention programs in schools across the state, for having naloxone kits in a housing complex, or for better enforcement of DUI laws. These are all environmental strategies that are supported by advocacy. So it's just a really important thing for us to be doing in prevention to be sure that we're addressing these emerging trends. So our next strategy is engaging in ongoing education and raising awareness, not just of the substance use trends that are emerging, but also our efforts to stop them. So education can really change or reinforce community norms about substance use, and it can also increase public awareness about those specific issues and problems that the community is facing. And so it's really important for us in prevention to be doing this work, especially around emerging trends, because that landscape is changing so quickly, just like we talked about with cannabis, and we have the knowledge about those risks, about the risk and protective factors, and some of the strategies to address these trends. So we really do have a responsibility to communicate that. And communication strategies, education awareness raising strategies are also evidence-based. A really great example of an evidence-based communication strategy is SAMHSA's Talk, They Hear You substance use prevention campaign. The goal of this campaign is really to increase parents' awareness of the prevalence of underage substance use, particularly underage drinking, as well as some of the risk, and then to equip them with knowledge, skills, and confidence to act, to really speak with their children about substance use and prevent it from occurring. There's lots of resources available as a part of this game, a campaign, videos showing how to start discussion with kids about substance use, online screening tools for parents to do with their kids, along with tons of other resources in multiple languages, all available for free. SAMHSA is actually required to submit evaluation reports to Congress as a part of this program. So it is evidence-based, which is great. And so a recent evaluation actually found that there was a 10% reduction in self-reported binge drinking among the youth who had received this messaging. And there was an increase in perceptions of harm from alcohol use. This has kind of been the biggest question that we've been talking about today. So for this to show a demonstrated increase is great as it relates to some of those emerging trends. And there's outcomes for not just for kids, but for parents too, right? Because they're the recipient of SAMHSA's messaging, but they also act as messengers to their kids. So the campaign also found increased awareness on the risks of alcohol use among adults and an increase in parents' confidence about actually being able to influence their kids' decisions regarding underage drinking. So then the fourth and final one that we have today is about identifying opportunities to collaborate with harm reduction. We know that substance misuse exists on a continuum, right? And so prevention and treatment can't really solve all of the issues that we're facing. And even though the evidence base is clearly growing, some of that data and awareness of emerging trends, especially related to the novel substances that Josh talked about earlier, can be limited, right? There are very few, if any, evidence-based programs that are addressing some novel substances like nitazines. So harm reduction is really helpful to kind of meet people where they're at along that substance use continuum to solve some of those more immediate issues. So harm reduction can provide education, reduce the spread of misinformation and stigma, and promote safety through things like safe injection sites, right? These are really critical harm reduction approaches because people who inject drugs are going to be less likely to share needles if they regularly use at a supervised injection site. Same can be said for syringe exchange services. Folks are able to get rid of their used syringes and exchange them for clean ones, which can significantly reduce the spread of some of those communicable viral diseases like HIV and hepatitis that can come from sharing syringes. Safer supply services provide prescribed medications to people who use drugs, and their use is actually overseen by a healthcare practitioner to make sure that we're preventing overdoses. And then, of course, test strips are crucial, especially for our emerging substances like xylazine or nitazines, where a lot of folks don't even know that they're using them. And given how strong they are, having those test strips to identify the presence of these substances can drastically reduce the chance of an overdose. And then harm reduction also reduces the barriers to receiving care that some people who use drugs might face because of the stigma or lack of resources or any sort of inequities that would stem from the social determinants of health. A great example of that is with wound care, especially for xylazine. By providing wound care in the community, you're keeping people safer and healthier without needing them to go, have insurance to seek medical care. Or, without the fear that if they go to the hospital, they might be incarcerated because they have recent substance use. Things like public health vending machines, mobile health clinics, these are all really key to, increasing access to really other important care services and providing linkages to resources like financial help, housing, behavioral health care, things like that. And so prevention can be a partner with these providers to be a referral source for folks who are seeking help. And these can all be really, really crucial in some of the more rural areas that some of the folks in the chat were talking about in the region where transportation to a service might be a significant barrier for folks. And I know that harm reduction's at times a little bit more controversial from a political perspective. We did hear a few weeks back that some states in the region, some harm reduction efforts were being pulled back a bit. But, like all the things that we have discussed, it is a part of a comprehensive approach to prevention. And we can use our skills in advocacy and raging education and awareness and partner with our colleagues in public health to try and support these opportunities when we can, because they're a really, really important part of the behavioral health continuum. And most importantly, they're keeping people alive. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Josh to wrap everything up for us. I really appreciate everyone's time today, so thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Olivia. So I know we threw a ton of info at you today. So if you do have any questions, please start thinking of them and typing them up as we'll get to questions in just a moment. But yeah, to put a bow on the content we covered today, if you're just looking at the raw numbers, cannabis use as well as fentanyl-involved overdoses, the most rapidly increasing issues in the region, but they may or may not be the most rapidly increasing issue in your own community. Also, other topics like xylazine or nitazines or anything else, because of their consequences, might be more of a concern as well. So it's really important to find out what are the key issues of your own community, doing that epidemiological surveillance that Olivia was talking about. It's also key to understand the causes behind these trends, and especially that potential role that declining perceptions of harm are causing. We've definitely been mentioning that one a lot today because it really does stand out, but there's also obviously a lot of other potential causes. And we need to know what those are because, right, addressing those factors is what prevention does. That's the mechanism through which we cause change. So it's really important to consider how this changing data might impact your work in the community. Are there going to be new priorities that you're going to focus on? But also remember that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You might already be implementing the best strategy to address emerging trends, right? Like you might already be serving the populations where you're seeing an increase, that there are increases in use. You might already be implementing the best evidence-based strategies. Just because there's a new trend doesn't mean you need to change everything. It just means you need to think about whether you have to change things. And speaking of thinking, one last question that I have for you all is, what's the first thing you will do based on what you learned today? I've actually never asked this question before at the end of a webinar, but I think it's a really good one. And I want to thank Derek for thinking of it. So yeah, if folks want to share, are you going to look for more data? Are you going to just talk about these substances, these topics with other people, so that we need to look into it? If you don't have an answer, that's totally fine too. But it's always good to come away from any training and technical assistance with some sort of practical next step. So if you don't have anything yet, I would strongly encourage you to think about what you'll do with this information and not just mind palace it away. And I see some ideas coming into the chat now, which is great. I appreciate that. If you do have any questions about anything we covered, because we did, as I said, throw a ton at you, please start putting those in the chat as well. And I also, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn things over to Derek, who I believe has a couple announcements or things to talk about as well before we wrap up today.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Olivia. Both of you did an amazing job sharing this immense amount of information with everyone here today, and we sincerely appreciate it. These are some of the resources that are available for you at the PTTC website. We've had several presentations on these topics, so if any one of them are particular of interest with you, then you can dive into some more information at the PTTC website at Region 6 with these links, and they will be included in your in the link that you'll receive for with this presentation in it. So you'll get all of these resources, which includes a presentation on cannabis legalization, one on the pathways for prevention, one on xylazine specifically, and also one about opioids and on methamphetamine. So don't feel like you had to learn everything today, but if one of these are particular interest in your area, in your state, we want you to have more information on that, and we do have it available for you. This is the time where we need your feedback. So we're going to put a link in the chat for you to use, and you can complete our survey. If we don't get your feedback, we don't know how well we've done, and we don't know how to plan for the future. So your feedback is extremely important to us. Please use the QR code that's on the screen. If you have a smartphone, or you can use the link in the chat. I see a lot of hearts coming in. Thanking you for your presentation, Josh and Olivia. You did an amazing job a lot of thank yous, a lot of thank yous coming in. So with these last few minutes that we have, we do want to give an opportunity for some feedback, but I also want to just let everyone know as we wrap up this webinar, I want to thank each and every one of you for your time, if I don't get a chance to, and your attention and your engagement, because the work you do in your communities is crucial. And I hope the insights and the strategies that we discussed today will further empower your efforts. So remember, identifying trends is only the first step, as Josh has reminded us. We then have to address them, and we have to work in collaboration with people, and we have to be innovative, as Olivia has impressed upon us today as well. So let's continue to stay connected with each other and share our knowledge and support one another as we move forward. And thank you again. At this time, if you have any questions for our speakers, they're here to answer them for the next 2 minutes.
Definitely. And thanks for kind words as well, Derek. I also want to note, not to put any pressure on Derek, but his contact info is on the final slide as well. So if you think of any questions later on, if you send them to him, I'm sure he'll send them to us. So if you need some time to digest what we said today, like I said, please reach out later on with any questions, because any one of these topics we covered, we could have done a whole webinar on. And as Derek showed, many of them have had their whole webinars done. So there's a lot of stuff that could be said. So definitely reach out if you have any questions. But just want to thank everyone. And we'll, as Derek said, we'll be here for another couple minutes if you do have any questions.